There's a house in a quiet, leafy suburb, the kind with meticulously manicured lawns and children's bikes left haphazardly in driveways. The kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen, and that's precisely the point. But the very air around this particular house, the one with the vibrant red door and the blooming rose bushes, held a secret. It was a secret so profound, so heartbreaking, it felt less like a story and more like a cruel joke being played on the world. It was a joke on a man named Ethan, and it had been playing out his entire life right under his nose. Ethan was the picture of a man who had it all. At 35, he was a successful architect, a devoted husband to his wife, Sarah, and a doting father to their 2 young daughters. His life was built on a foundation of love and stability, a stark contrast to the emptiness he had always felt, a quiet ache he couldn't quite place. He was an only child, adopted at birth by the Whitlock family. 2 kind, older parents who had given him everything he could ever want. They had been open and honest with him from the start about his adoption. He was special, they told him. He was a gift, and he believed them. But sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, he saw a stranger. Not a stranger in the sense that he didn't recognize himself, but a stranger in the sense that he didn't see any part of himself in his parents. No shared laugh lines, no matching eye color, no similar way of holding his head when he was deep in thought. It was a constant, subtle reminder that he was not, in fact, theirs. This feeling, this low hum of a question, had been his constant companion. He had always been grateful, fiercely so, for the Whitlocks. They had saved him. They had given him a life. But he couldn't shake the need to know. Who were his biological parents? What did they look like? Why had they given him up? This need wasn't born of resentment, but of an insatiable curiosity, a primal urge to understand his own roots. He tried to find them over the years, a few half-hearted searches online, a call to the adoption agency that led to a dead end. The information was sealed, the records were private. He was told it was for the best, that his biological parents wished to remain anonymous. He respected their wishes, or at least he told himself he did. But a part of him never stopped looking. The irony of the situation, the terrible, bone-chilling irony, was that the answer he sought was living just a few feet away. For as long as Ethan could remember, the house next door, the one with the meticulously kept garden and the swing hanging from a towering oak tree, was occupied by the Miller family. Thomas and Eleanor Miller, a gentle, quiet couple in their late 60s, who had always been the quintessential neighbors. They baked cookies for the Whitlocks at Christmas. They watered their plants when they were on vacation. And they had watched Ethan grow up from a distance, with a quiet, almost melancholic fondness. To Ethan, they were simply Thomas and Eleanor, the Millers next door. To Thomas and Eleanor, he was something else entirely. He was the ghost of a decision they had made decades ago. A ghost that lived, breathed, and thrived just over their shared fence. The pieces of this puzzle began to fall into place not through some dramatic revelation, but through a simple, mundane act. Thomas Miller, a man of few words, had a heart attack. A minor one, the doctors said, but it was enough to shake the quiet rhythm of their lives. Ethan, being the good neighbor he was, offered to help Eleanor with their yard work. It was a blistering July afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer. As Ethan was pulling weeds from a flower bed near the back of the house, his shovel hit something hard. He dug around it, unearthing a small, tarnished metal box. It was a lockbox, old and worn, tucked away beneath the rose bushes, as if someone had hidden it and then forgotten it. He felt a moment of hesitation. It wasn't his to open, but the heat, the curiosity, the sheer strangeness of finding something so secretively buried overcame his better judgment. He pried it open with the tip of his shovel. Inside, nestled among a few faded photos, was a birth certificate. The name on the certificate was Ethan David Miller, and the date of birth was his own. He stared at it, the words blurring together. Ethan David Miller. He turned the box over, his hands trembling. The photos were of a young woman, no more than 20, with a kind face and a cascade of brown hair. In one photo, she was smiling brightly, her arm around a young man with a familiar, boyish grin. A grin that, to his shock, mirrored his own. But it was the final photo that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a picture of the same young woman, this time holding a newborn baby, wrapped tightly in a white blanket. She was looking down at the baby with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love. It was almost unbearable to witness. And in the corner, written in a shaky, elegant script, were 2 words, "Our son." Ethan closed the box, his mind racing. This couldn't be right. There must be a mistake. He didn't know these people. But as he looked up, his gaze fell on the house next door, the house of Thomas and Eleanor Miller. The house with the red door. The house he had been living next to for his entire life. The realization, slow and painful, began to dawn on him. The woman in the photo, she had the same eyes as Eleanor Miller. And the man, he had the same gentle way of standing as Thomas. The secret, the cruel joke, was finally revealing itself. His biological parents, they were right here, all along. The lockbox felt like a ticking time bomb in Ethan's hands. He shoved it back into the hole, covered it with dirt, and pretended he'd never seen it. But the image of the birth certificate, the name Ethan David Miller, and the photos of a young Thomas and Eleanor holding a baby, were now seared into his mind. He went home in a daze, the carefully constructed reality of his life crumbling around him. The man who had it all, who had a clear, linear history of being adopted by the wonderful Whitlocks, now had a new, horrifying backstory. A story that began not in a distant city, but in the house next door. He couldn't bring himself to tell Sarah. How could he? How do you tell your wife that the quiet, unassuming couple next door, the people who brought you casseroles when you were sick and waved to you from their porch every morning, were your parents? The people who gave you up, only to then spend a lifetime watching you live with another family? For days, Ethan was a ghost in his own home. He was there, but he wasn't. He'd sit at the dinner table with Sarah and his daughters, and his mind would wander to the Miller's house. He'd catch glimpses of Eleanor through their kitchen window, a frail woman with silver hair, puttering around her garden. He saw Thomas, sitting on his porch swing, a newspaper in his lap, his gaze fixed on the empty spot where the oak tree stood. Ethan began to see the small, subtle connections he had never noticed before. The way Thomas would always offer him a small, knowing smile when they spoke. The way Eleanor's eyes would fill with a silent, unspeakable sadness when she looked at him. He had always interpreted it as simple neighborly affection, a gentle fondness for the boy who had grown up next door. But now it took on a sinister, tragic new meaning. They weren't just watching him grow up. They were watching the life they couldn't have. They were watching their own son live a life that wasn't theirs to share. The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight. It was a betrayal, but not just a simple betrayal. It was a deep, soul-shaking lie that had been living side by side with his happiness for 35 years. The Whitlocks, his loving parents, who had told him his birth parents wanted to be anonymous. Did they know? Did they know that his real family was just a fence away? The more he thought about it, the more the foundation of his life felt like it was built on sand. The loving, perfect family he had known was now tainted with the bitter taste of a secret. His parents, the people who had given him everything, had been part of a lie. The Millers, the kind old neighbors, had been part of an even bigger one. A lie of omission, a constant, silent presence that had haunted his life without him even knowing. He finally confronted his parents, the Whitlocks, one cold evening. He sat them down in their living room, the room where he had spent countless hours listening to them read him stories, where he had opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays. He held the worn birth certificate he had retrieved from the lockbox in his hand, a small paper weapon. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Did you know who they were? Did you know they lived next door?" His mother, a woman who rarely showed emotion, broke down in tears. His father, a man of quiet strength, simply looked away. The silence was deafening, more damning than any confession. Finally, his father spoke, his voice thick with age and regret. "We promised them, Ethan. We promised them we would never tell you." The story unfolded in fragments, a painful tapestry woven from guilt and fear. The Millers were young, barely out of college, when they had him. They were terrified. They had no money, no stability, no way to provide for a child. They knew his parents, the Whitlocks, through a mutual friend. The Whitlocks had been trying to have a child for years, with no success. A deal was struck. Quiet, private adoption. The Millers were promised that they could still be a part of his life, a secret part, from a distance. They bought the house next door, a testament to their love and their regret. They wanted to watch him grow up, to know that he was happy and safe. The Whitlocks, in their desperation to have a child of their own, agreed to this impossible, painful arrangement. They thought they were protecting him, protecting everyone. But they were wrong. They were all wrong. The story was a mess of good intentions and devastating consequences. It was a tragedy of love and loss, a symphony of what-ifs. And at the center of it all was Ethan, the result of a secret pact, the boy who had two families, and yet, at this moment, felt like he had none. The lie had been born of love, yes, but it had grown into something monstrous. It had stolen his identity, his history, the very essence of who he thought he was. He was not just an adopted son. He was a secret, a living, breathing secret that had walked the line between two lives, completely unaware. He left his parents' house that night, the weight of their confession a physical burden on his shoulders. He didn't go home to Sarah. He drove aimlessly, the suburban streets blurring into a silent, mocking landscape. The world he knew had vanished, replaced by a ghost story where he was the ghost. He had a family. They lived next door, and they had watched him from behind a veil of neighborly smiles and quiet waves. He had to see them. He had to face them. He had to know why. He found himself standing at their front door in the dead of night. The house, usually so warm and inviting, looked desolate under the dim glow of the porch light. He knocked, the sound echoing in the silent street. Eleanor opened the door, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. She must have seen the truth in his face, the raw, unfiltered pain that had been simmering for days. She didn't say a word. She simply stepped aside and let him in. Thomas was sitting in his usual chair, a blanket over his legs, a book on the table beside him. He looked old, frail, and terribly, terribly tired. The air in the room was thick with unsaid words, with 3 decades of a lie. Ethan stood there, a silent accusation, a living, breathing question mark. He didn't know what to say. Why? Was all he could manage, the word a simple, desperate plea. Eleanor began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Thomas simply stared at him, his gaze a mixture of regret and an overwhelming, palpable love. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound. "We were so young, Ethan," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "We were just kids ourselves. I had a job at a factory. Eleanor was working part-time at a diner. We had nothing. We were terrified. We didn't know how we could give you the life you deserved." He talked about their friends, the Whitlocks, and how they had been so desperate for a child. He talked about the impossible choice, the wrenching pain of having to give up their son. But then, he explained the other part, the part that was so hard to comprehend. "We couldn't let you go completely," Eleanor said, her voice now a choked sob. "We saw the house next door go up for sale and it felt like a sign, a chance to still be close to you, to know you were safe, to see you grow up happy." She described the years of watching him from their window, of seeing him learn to ride a bike, of seeing him play catch with his adoptive father in the backyard. The small, stolen moments that had kept them alive. They watched him go to prom, graduate from college, fall in love, and start a family of his own. It was a self-inflicted torture, a silent, agonizing vigil. They never interfered. They never said a word. They simply watched. The story was even more complicated and heartbreaking than he could have imagined. It wasn't just a simple adoption. It was a lifelong drama, a silent play with 3 main actors and 1 oblivious star. Ethan, the star. The Millers, the tragic parents who watched from the wings. And the Whitlocks, the adoptive parents who had, in their own desperate love, become complicit in this cruel deception. He felt a storm of emotions raging inside him. Rage at the lies, grief at the lost time, confusion, at the sheer strangeness of it all. How do you feel about a couple who gave you up, but then lived next door to you for your entire life, watching you grow? He looked at their faces, etched with the years of silent suffering. They weren't monsters. They were just two people who had made a terrible, impossible choice, and had been paying for it every single day since. The more they talked, the more the anger began to subside, replaced by a deep, hollow sadness. A sadness for the life he could have had with them, a life that was now forever lost. A sadness for them, for the pain they had carried for so long. He learned that they had a daughter, a beautiful girl named Clara, who had been born a few years after he was adopted. She was a constant reminder of the life they had built after giving him up, a life that was happy, but always felt incomplete. Clara knew a version of the truth. She knew she had an older brother who had been adopted, but she never knew who he was or where he lived. The secret had been kept from her as well, a different kind of pain, a different kind of wound. The lies, it seemed, had spread like a disease, infecting everyone in its path. As they sat there in the quiet living room, the weight of their collective pain was almost unbearable. He realized that the Millers had not just lost a son. They had lost the ability to be parents. They had traded their right to raise him for the chance to simply watch him live. And the Whitlocks, in their desire to be parents, had unknowingly become part of a web of deceit that was now tearing their family apart. Ethan finally understood the quiet melancholy in Eleanor's eyes, the way Thomas would always look at him with a silent question. The question was always, "Do you know who I am?" And the answer, for 35 years, had been no. He had been so close and yet so far. The revelation was a devastating blow, a truth that ripped the bandage off a wound he didn't even know he had. The healing process would be slow, and he knew it would require a level of grace and forgiveness he wasn't sure he possessed. But as he looked at Thomas and Eleanor, two people who had been strangers his entire life and yet were so intimately a part of his story, he felt something else, something deeper than anger. He felt a profound sense of loss and a strange, quiet connection. A connection that had always been there, a silent thread of DNA that had woven itself into the fabric of his life, a thread he could finally see. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could start to build a future where the secret no longer held him captive. He just had to figure out how. The days that followed were a blur of raw emotion and painful conversations. Ethan had to tell Sarah everything. The shock, the hurt, the disbelief on her face mirrored his own. She was supportive, but also deeply troubled by the scale of the lie. The idea that their idyllic neighborhood had been the stage for such a long-running, silent tragedy was hard to swallow. He spoke to his adoptive parents, the Whitlocks, again and again, trying to find a way to forgive them for their part in it. They were heartbroken, not just for the pain they had caused him, but for the damage the truth had done to the family they had built. They had acted out of love, a desperate, selfish love, and the consequences were now a heavy burden on everyone. There was no easy way forward. There was no magic cure for the years of deceit. The only path was through the pain, through the long, difficult process of rebuilding trust and finding a new kind of normal. Ethan began to spend time with the Millers, the quiet, almost strangers who were his biological parents. It was awkward at first. So much unsaid history hung in the air between them. They were like two ships that had passed in the night for decades, only to finally collide in a devastating, beautiful wreck. He learned about their lives, their hobbies, the simple things that had made them who they were. He found out that Eleanor loved to garden, a passion he shared. He learned that Thomas was an avid chess player, a hobby that had been a quiet solace for him over the years. They talked about his childhood, about the things he loved, about his family, about the life he had. It was a bizarre, surreal experience. Two sides of the same story finally being told in the same room. He learned that Thomas and Eleanor had never stopped thinking about him. He was a constant, unspoken presence in their lives. They had celebrated his birthdays in secret, watching from their window as he blew out the candles on his cake. They had cheered silently for him at his high school football games, their hearts swelling with a pride they could never express. It was a love that was silent, but no less profound. The most difficult conversation was with his own daughters. How do you explain to two young girls that their grandfather and grandmother live next door, but they're not really their grandparents? That the couple who has always been so kind and sweet to them are actually their other grandparents? It was a truth that was too complex, too painful to explain. So he didn't. He told them that Thomas and Eleanor were a special kind of family, an important part of their lives now, and that was enough for them. They began to spend more time with them, and the girls, with their pure, innocent love, began to bridge the decades-long gap that had separated them. A new kind of family was forming, one built not on the perfect foundation of a lie, but on the messy, beautiful reality of the truth. It was a slow, difficult process, filled with tears and painful reminders. But it was also filled with a new kind of love, a love that was finally free to be expressed. He had found a part of himself he didn't even know was missing. He had found his roots. The ending of this story isn't a neat and tidy one. There's no dramatic reveal and a perfect, happy family reunion. The scars remain. The pain of the lost years will never truly go away. But something else has taken its place. A quiet, profound sense of peace. Ethan found a way to forgive. He forgave his adoptive parents for their well-intentioned lie. He forgave his biological parents for their impossible choice. And most importantly, he found a way to forgive himself for a secret that wasn't even his to begin with. The two families, the Whitlocks and the Millers, were now connected in a way they never could have imagined. They were two sides of the same coin, two families who, through a series of painful choices, had created one man. And that one man, the boy who had been adopted but whose family lived next door, had finally found his way home. This story isn't just about a man who found his biological parents. It's about the lies we tell to protect the ones we love, the choices we make out of fear, and the profound, enduring power of family in all its messy, complicated, and beautiful forms. It's a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary truths are hidden in the most ordinary places. And sometimes the very thing we've been looking for our entire lives is waiting for us, just a few feet away. This story is just one of many, a chilling tale of secrets and lies that was hiding in plain sight. If the story touched you, if it made you think, or if it made you feel, then please take a moment to hit that like button. We've got more stories like this one, tales of human struggle and triumph that will leave you captivated and questioning everything you thought you knew. So make sure you subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our journey into the unknown. We're just getting started.